I know there's a button on it somewhere. Oh, it's on now. Oh boy. Okay, I'm looking for the lighting, which would be. Well, that didn't work. Ooh, wait, something did work. I don't like it. I want tactile feedback. Does the light level meet with everyone's approval? Excellent. Okay, yeah, she will adjust and you'll be able to see the screen better. And you don't want to have to see me. I'll hide behind this monitor up here. So, welcome to our first installment of Philly.net 2018. Hopefully, everybody had a good holiday, good New Year, and we're ready to get back to work and learn lots of stuff. So, I am right now looking at Meetup. That's our website for signing up. Do we have anybody here tonight that's new to Philly.net? We got one. Excellent. And you found a buddy already, so he'll tell you what to do. Okay. So Philly.net's been in existence for we're going on 16 years. It's a long time. And we run all our meetings now basically through Meetup. I'm going to show you a couple things tonight. So this is the meeting we have tonight. Oops, my mistake. So tonight we have React plus Redux plus RxJS. On the right side, you'll see some upcoming meetups. And there's photos and all sorts of fun things. A little bit of a discussion group. So the meetup company changed their interface finally in the last couple weeks, so you have to sort of get used to it. It has a sort of modern look to it, but it actually removes some of the features that we used to rely on. So I just wanted to show you a couple things real quick. Down here, it says our group, which is sort of the home page, and then it has meetups. And in meetups, and some of what you're seeing, I'm an administrator, so I get to see more things than you do. But you can see the upcoming meetups. And right now, we have 3 of them registered. You can see all the past meetups if you want to go back in time and see what we've been doing. And you can see proposed and drafts. We don't use those too much. What we do use is the calendar. You only see the calendar when you go into the Meetup tab. And the calendar shows you the old look and feel. And it shows you a nice little calendar and telling you whether or not you're signed up for those particular meetings. That's really handy. You might want to take this URL and bookmark it because this is the best way to know when we have a meeting here. You'll see that this month we have a meeting today. That's a hands-on lab. Typically, the hands-on labs are the first Wednesday of the month. And we have a monthly meeting. Now, notice this is one of the odd months where we actually have 5 Wednesdays. So we get all confused. And because of some other scheduling that's going on with Microsoft events, we were pushed back to the 24th for our monthly meeting. So if you want to see what's going on there, you can just click on that. And that'll show you that in 3 weeks, we have Jason Van Brackle, and he's going to talk about Kubernetes and Docker and things like that, all things containers in the cloud. And then we're happy to announce that Jeff Fritz, who's on the Visual Studio team, he's going to show us an update of what's new in the Visual Studio product family, including the .NET framework. And he'll go into all of the latest, greatest releases, things like that. So that'll be in 3 weeks here. Then in February, our lab series continues, and it's our last lab that we have on the sort of React a curriculum. And what you'll see is that we're going to have a lab where we're going to do a very simple application. I guarantee it'll have to do with sports because that's always what I use for demos. And we'll probably do that same application in React, Angular, and Vue. And that sort of ties into the presentation we had 2 weeks ago here, where we had just demos of those technologies, and then we'll do some hands-on with that. The other thing you'll notice for me is when I mouse over this, I get very useful information, like how many are on the wait list, how many have marked yes. Okay, now, there's a thing called a note. A note has a different color. If you go to the note, what you'll see there is that staff members like Tony Vergoldi and myself will go into the note and we keep track of who we think is going to speak and who has accepted until they get confirmed and it turns into a meeting that you can actually sign up for. So that's basically how you keep track of what's going on with our meetings. And if you didn't hear, we have in March, that's the next month. In March, we don't have any hands-on labs because we're going to have a code camp. So it's been almost a year since we had a code camp here. And now that they've finished all the construction, they're going to welcome us back and we're going to behave. And, you know, we'll have the divider up for that one and have 2 sessions in here. And then like 7 or so downstairs. So it'll be about the same size as it used to be. Just slightly smaller. Leaner and meaner. Excuse me? No, not that much. So, but we're going to do the same basic thing. We're going to do the full day training on a Friday, no sponsors. And then on Saturday, the standard, hour, 15-minute sessions with the sponsors down in the lobby. You know the drill. So you'll be seeing some emails about that in the next week or so as we start to drum up business. Yes? No. I could fix that if you want. You know, I'll see if I didn't even notice that it had a AM or PM. Yeah, there you go. There we go. That's pretty easy to do. See, real time. Yes, testing or whatever we do. Yep. There will be something that and it's interesting because since we switched to Meetup about 2 years ago, not everyone is on the old mailing list, which is technically in MailChimp. Some of you are only in Meetup, so we have to send letters out to everybody. But we'll flood the airwaves with this. And I already have the dates and stuff somewhere. I sent out an email about that, but I have the dates of when you're going to sign up and when we get the speakers and all. So we have the whole timeline down. So any questions on club activity? All righty. That's good. So what are we doing tonight? So we're doing something a little more advanced. And we're going to talk about something called Redux and another thing called RxJS. So how many were here last month for the React lab? So that's about 2/3 of you. Okay, so we did a little demo there, and we got into some basic stuff. When we did that, I used an example, and let me see if I can find it. You're welcome to type this. We're not going to do, yeah, spelling does count sometimes. So last month I showed you this utility called codesandbox.io. And if you followed along, you actually did some examples in there. And Code Sandbox allows you to do quick and dirty. It's sort of like a playpen or sandbox. So you can create code examples and you save them online. And everything runs using an online editor and online browser. So it's really easy to do a demonstration. The nice thing about this is once you make it, you can fork it, create your own URL, and then send it to a coworker or a friend or an enemy. And they can go in and look at what you did and learn from it, and then they can change it and make their own version. And there are literally tens and tens of thousands of samples here. So it's really useful to learn. And you can see as this cycles through that this is set up currently for React Preact, which is sort of a cousin of React, Vue, and then this thing called Svelte, which I have no idea what that one does. Does anybody use that one? Okay. So the other thing you could do is you can align this with your GitHub account, and if you do, then you can go in and you can see what things you have worked on. So you'll see that, oops. There's one that I did called Welcome to the Philadelphia Eagles. And basically I did like 6 or 7 of these things so far. So tonight, later on, we're going to look at this one. This is the one that I did for the monthly meeting. And this one actually uses Vue. And I think this is the last one I did with you guys. I don't remember. Let's go take a look at it. Yeah. So this is the one we did a month ago. And what I showed you is how to build a simple React application. And we took that and we added routing. So these are actually, you can see the routes change up here on the URL. So there's the stadium schedule. So I'm just doing this to review where we were. And what we learned to work with React, some basic stuff. Typically you start with an index.html, which they show here, but it hides a lot of the details of how it actually loads the React library and wires it up. So all you do is show the essentials. So we have an ID of root, a place to like put our React rendered components. And then you go into your index.js, and that's where you start making things happen in code. So to do this, you have to do a render method in React, and you have to tell the output of that render where you want it to go on the page. And you see down here, it is going to go get an element by ID called root. So it'll basically take and replace this div with whatever you render. That's the basics of how React works. And then inside here, we use a syntax. Does anyone remember what that's called from last month? JSX. So you actually are mixing HTML markup in the middle of your JavaScript code. And transpilers like Babel and TypeScript understand this and know how to take that and turn it into executable JavaScript that runs in any browser, or any modern browser. So basically, you have this thing called browser router, and that's required if you're a routed app. and then the app itself is there. And you say, well, what is app? Well, you have to define app. So browser router is coming from a package that you downloaded from npm. Okay, and that is wrapped around the entire app so that the router can keep track of, as you switch views, which ones are supposed to display, and you can do the back button and stuff like that. App comes from this thing called /components/apps. So if I open up that folder, this is app, and app has a header and a main, and that's it. And then the header and main are themselves defined as different components. So the header actually has the links that go across the top: home, roster, schedule, and stadium. And then main is a routing component, and the routing component can switch which views display on the screen as you go to different routes. So this is where we left things last month, and it's pretty straightforward stuff. When you do stadium, all you're doing is a simple IMG tag. That's it. When you're doing home, all you're doing is saying welcome to the Philadelphia Eagles. And then we got a little fancy with like schedule. We actually went in and looped through some data. And again, I'm showing you this just to remind everybody where we were. So there was a API that returned the schedule, and that is just read from a constant. So that's where we were last month. And you could go and search for this and make a copy of it and play with it all you want. So it's pretty straightforward how you take the data and display it in a React component. And if you remember from last month, when we do something like schedule, all we're doing is we're taking the schedule API, which is a constant or a function. We're exercising the all, and then we're mapping that, and that basically is a repeater. It's looping through each of the things in the schedule. And then we access the data inside it by using single curly braces, or what they call mustache syntax. It's that straightforward. Okay, now, tonight, we wanted to talk about this thing called Redux. So why would you go from this to a more complex level using these extra tools? Has anyone used Redux? Okay, a lot or just a little? Quite a bit, good. So you'll correct me as I show things. So the idea is this is a really simple app. It's basically got 4 views. And technically it has about, if you count on the left, it's got about 6 or 7 components. But there's not much going on. And the data for this right now is just hard-coded as 2 functions. And one of them is an API. See, there's a, well, this is actually an object. And a function that returns all of the data in the object. And then this one was for the schedule. So hard-coded. How do we get from here to a complex line of business application or a fancy public website where you're going to have dozens and dozens of components in one page? How do we keep track of all the data? How do we keep track of how the data gets updated and maybe displayed multiple places? Okay. Does anyone, has anyone done a lot of work with Angular 1? Yes. So I have. And that was one of the problems of Angular 1. It was really complicated as an application grew to keep track of where the data was getting changed. And the reason is that if you use a standard MVC, Model View Controller, or MVVM, Model View Model approach. It's designed so that there's a model, in other words, a set of objects with data in them. And as they change, Angular senses they changed and automatically updates the screen. The problem is that you have certain elements, like inputs, that can then change the model. And if you have that two-way binding, every time you change the model, what must Angular do? It has to go through the DOM and check and make sure if anything needs to be updated. Now, in the world of Angular, especially Angular 1, it was very tightly coupled to the DOM, and it actually went and changed DOM things directly. And if you had too much data in your model and too many changes going on, it really slowed down the application, made it unbearable and usable. So since we had the class 2 weeks ago and we showed you React and Vue, does anyone remember what React and Vue do different from Angular? The latter? They have something called a virtual DOM. Some people refer to it as a shadow DOM. So what React does is, as it senses changes in the data, it doesn't go and change the DOM immediately, because the DOM insertion and deletion of elements is very costly in terms of processor cycles. So what they do in React is they create in memory sort of a data structure that mimics. You don't have to worry about this. This happens within the framework. But you have this thing, the shadow DOM, that mimics what's going on in your data. It determines what things need to change, and then it has a little engine that goes through, sort of like a diff engine, like you would do in your source code. And it says, look at the DOM, look at what the shadow has, and see if there's any differences. It makes a list of all those differences, and then puts them in a queue, and then cycles through the queue until it's empty. And you might only have to change a couple LIs in your screen. So what happens is that there's very little change to your DOM in the browser, so everything refreshes smoother and quicker. Okay? So that's how, theoretically, React and Vue supposed to run faster than Angular. Now, by the time you get to Angular 5, they're pretty close in performance. But the reason you turn to something like Redux is, as your application gets more complicated and has more data points, it's easy to lose track of things, and it's easier or harder to test. So this is where the slides come in, and I'm not sure how to distribute the slides tonight, and I don't know why I want that there. I want this here. Let's see. I guess I can just do a show. There we go. So we will make these available to you at some point. So, of course, we remember that React was invented at Facebook. Okay? And they wanted to make some kind of framework to make it easier to display all of this stuff on your Facebook pages. And if you think back, how many of you have been using Facebook for like 5 years or a decade? Okay. So back in the old days, it was a more traditional application. You'd go in and it would show a bunch of posts or whatever we're going to refer to them as. And then a couple of years ago, Facebook started getting really fancy. And what I mean by that is you could see the posts, but they had little counters at the top, like how many are unread. Okay? And then as you go down the screen, all of a sudden, magically, the screen wouldn't have a bottom. It would all of a sudden just load more stuff. And as you go down, it kept reloading it. Okay? So to get stuff like that to work, Facebook had to do a lot of fancy programming so that you could have sort of this scrolling screen of posts. And they ran into, you might remember this, but a couple of years ago, they delivered a new version of their Messenger, and people complained a lot about it. And the reason they complained is it was buggy. And the reason it was buggy is because they were using this kind of technology, but they couldn't keep track of all the asynchronous calls, and things weren't aligned in real time. So think about how fast messages come in now on Facebook in your world. And they couldn't keep track of the messages coming in, displaying, and the little counters at the top telling how many messages were read and unread. And basically that led to the invention of this technology that I'm going to show you here. So they came up with this thing called the Flux Architecture. And basically, instead of doing standard MVC, what they do is they set up what is called a unidirectional data flow, or one-way binding. And what you want to do is create a data store that eventually is going to display on your pages. But you don't want the page to be able to directly change that data store. And the technique they came up with had to do with sending messages. So has anybody worked in like in a message-based architecture, either on the front end or a back end? Service fabric, have you ever heard of that? Okay, so we're getting fancy here. But so basically what they're doing here is sort of similar to service fabric for the front end. And to get something to change in your data, you have to actually send a message to this thing called, in this case, they called it Flux. You have to send a message to Flux, and then Flux would actually use this thing called the dispatcher to go change the data. And the arrows here are very important because they imply that the data always flows in one direction. You have to send a message. The message is then dispatched, updates the store. Once the store is updated, the view subscribes to the store and says, if anything changes, let me know and I'll display it. Okay? Now, what happens if you have an input element in your view? How's it going to make a change to the data? It has to create a message. So if you could visualize, this input element would then have to create a message and send it back and run it through the pipeline again to get the data to update. And what the problem this solved is then you can, if you think about multiple arrows here, you could have 50 views all looking at the store at the same time. And you might have a main window in the middle that shows your messenger messages. And then you might have a little tiny window that shows the messages from your friends, your close friends. Then you have a bunch of things at the top with little numbers, like this is how many messages I didn't read, and this is how many from my friends. And by building this architecture, they were able to get all of that to work seamlessly without timing problems. So that's what they came up with. And then some guy said, oh, okay, before we get into that, let me show you this slide. So where is this used? Well, in React, there's a tool that most people use called Redux. There are many different things that came out, maybe 10, 20 of different variations. The one that's most popular is called Redux. So that is the Flux architecture for React. And you take that, and then there's a little thing you add to your project called React-redux that sort of wires the two together. And then finally, time permitting today, we're also going to show you something called RxJS. Does anybody use that? Does anybody use Angular 5? You're using RxJS. Okay. So RxJS is a sort of a better way to access data, especially if you're doing like calls to REST backends. And it uses, instead of just doing a HTTP call with a promise, it creates something called an observable. And an observable has magical powers that a promise doesn't. And basically what happens is you can cancel a query, you can cancel an HTTP call, you can have multiple people subscribe to it and get the results and stuff like that. So anyways, that's how you make a much more complex application that would be on the level of a Facebook page. You use these extra tools. Now, in the other two top frameworks, Angular basically does this stuff, but it does it in a slightly different way. And in Angular, they have these things called providers. And you create a provider, and it can act as a store and send data. And then you send a message to the provider telling it to update itself. And it sort of does the same thing. And then Vue, the other one that I showed 2 weeks ago, Vue has an add-on called Vuex, which is the same thing that Redux does for React. So, Redux basically is a place to put your data. And it creates this thing they refer to as the store. And the store becomes the single source of truth. So in the example I showed you about 10 minutes ago, I had 2 pages. I had a schedule, and then I had another one that showed a bunch of players, a roster. Well, those came from separate functions, completely different files. What you want to do with Redux is you want to put all that stuff into one object. So all the data on the page essentially comes from one object. And you're thinking, well, gee, how do I create that one object that has all the data we need? Aren't you thinking that? Yes. Well, there's a way to do that. And just, we'll follow the slides. You'll see, you'll understand in a few minutes. Okay, so the guy who made this, it's really odd. He was giving a talk somewhere in Europe, and he was going to try and explain Flux to the audience. And he couldn't think of a good way to explain it. So he wrote an example in React, in JavaScript to work with React to show him how to do this. And the sample he wrote became React or Redux. And that's what like hundreds of thousands of people use today. It's based on Elm. Elm uses functional programming. And there's a lot of that functional programming stuff in here, it's a good thing to learn. So basically, everything you're going to change has to have an action. An action is just a JS function, JavaScript function. And then you create these things called reducers. That's the answer to your question, sir. How do you make this big object that has a bunch of arrays and a bunch of other properties? How do I keep that thing so that it has the correct data in it that everybody can display? And you do that by creating these functions that are called reducers. And reducers take one little piece of your store, and they are designed to update that one piece. So if you want something like favorite team would be a field inside your store. Then you'd have a reducer that would be called something like set favorite team. And when you send a message to it, it would take whatever came along in the reducer parameters, and it would set that in the state. Okay? So, that's called Redux. Now, Redux, you start with these things called actions. And I'll show you some code for this in a few minutes. But there's a lot of terminology we have to understand before it makes any sense. So, Redux, you start with these things called actions. So instead of thinking about your application in terms of data structures, you want to think about messages. And if you ever worked in something like Service Bus, it's very similar. Does anybody back in the day remember MSMQ? Mainframes, yes. MQ series, same idea. MSMQ was the old way Microsoft did this 10 years ago. They used to have a thing called a transaction server, and way back in the day. Okay, but the whole thing has to do with sending messages. So you think about the messages you can send. So a message might be, let's think about football, because we're in the middle of that run for the playoffs here. But, You could add a team. You could list teams. Those are messages I want to send. Or get teams or something like that. And you come up with this list of messages, and they are technically called actions. In Redux, an action is just a string. So it's a string name. And then what you do is you create an action, and when you send the action, you have to give it a type, which is a string, something like add player, and then you send a payload, and the payload would actually be like an object that would say like first name, last name, position. Okay? The actions can then take their data and have it stored in the state. And the state is an object that stores everything about the data you need in your application. It gets a little confusing using the word state and store. Basically, the state is the concept of an object that holds everything. A store is an instance of a state. Okay? So, in the world of React, you want this thing called the state so that it can't be changed by mistake. To do that, a lot of people define it as a constant, because if it's a constant, you then can't go in and change it. And they call that immutability. Okay, well, how are we going to work with this data if I can't change the state? Stay tuned to the next slide. Okay, when you create the state, oftentimes you have to initialize it, and you can do that from a variable, a function, etc. The magic part of this in Redux is what's called a reducer. A reducer is a function, and it's called, you are using what is called a pure function. The concept of a pure function is it can't change the data that's passed into it. What's that? Yes, it's part of functional programming, yes. So, the way reducers work, you pass in the current state, you pass in the action. Inside the action, there's a string that says what the message is. There's a payload that says this is the data I need you to add to the store. Okay? The reducer then makes a change and returns a new object. So reducers always return a new object. They never change the existing state. Now, what's interesting about this is you constantly get back this object that has everything in you need. But what's cool is that there are a lot of tools that you can run in the background. Since you're always making a new object, there are tools that keep track of the old ones. So you can go back in the console and actually see a history of your changes as your data changed. And that's really fascinating and useful to see. Okay, so when you do a reducer, as I said, you send it in the action type, and you go in, make a new state, return it, and then what you end up doing is taking and making a bunch of reducers that change different parts of your data structure. And then sometimes those get reused, so you can sort of compose reducers out of other reducers. And then the last thing you want to know about reducers is that it is very typical, especially in React, to combine all the reducers into one single function. And that function then is the thing that we're going to use inside React. And that function basically knows when you send it a message which little reducer, like child reducers, actually have to do the work to get done. And it's all based on these message strings. I'm going to make you look at code that has this in it, so you'll be able to understand, hopefully, some of it. Now, you use a function called createStore. that creates a store instance. And basically the store is an instance of the state, where the state is the sort of schema of the data that you want. The store then has some functions attached to it. You have a get state that you could use anytime you want to get the current data that should be displayed. And then you have a dispatch. The dispatch is the hook that allows you to send in the action that can change the data. And I do apologize, there's so many words up here. It would be nice to have pictures, but I'll get through this in a few minutes. Okay, so it's pretty basic. There's not a lot you can do with the store. There's just a couple calls. But basically, the important ones are get state, dispatch, and subscribe. And anybody that wants to know whether anything changes in the state or store, they're going to subscribe. And those are the components that actually want to display things as the data changes. They have a higher level that gets a little fancier called middleware. And basically, a middleware is a store that allows you to add more code functionality as messages are passed back and forth. So you can do some logic in there. Okay, the other thing that you do with actions that's very typical is you create what are called action creators. These are functions that instead of you calling an action, dispatching an action directly with sending data, you're actually going to call the function. The function is going to have parameters, and then inside the function it's going to create the action package that needs to be dispatched. Okay, we're almost there. I'll prove it to you. There's only 2 more slides. The other thing I want you to look for when we go into some sample code is this concept of a provider. Now, notice my heading at the top. Everything up until this point was part of Redux. Do you think React is required to use Redux? No. You can use Redux with Vue, Angular, Knockout, any framework you want. There's tools and libraries that sort of wire all that up. Redux is just a way to work with a data store using message passing. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is this library on GitHub called React-redux. This is the thing that takes Redux and makes it work with your React components. And it basically does it with 2 commands. One is called provider. And you'll see this in about 4 or 5 minutes. What you're going to see is that when you create an app, and just so you don't go blind looking at slides, I'm going to show you. Remember when I showed you my sample from last month? It did this in index.js. It wrapped the entire app with a browser router so that every part of the app, every component, knew how to work with the router. That's what provider does. Provider is going to wrap your app so that every piece of your application knows how to get data from the store. So it's sort of like, you know, remember session back in session state back in the old ASP.NET days? All right, so finally, and this is the last one, there's a command called connect. And let me see if I can explain some of this to you from the code I don't remember if my code used that much of this last time. Do you remember we talked about props? Props are used to pass data into a component. And I'm trying to think if there's an example here that actually uses props, and I don't think there is. The sample that we had 2 months ago would have had all that. But basically, there's this function or a method you can call called connect. And what it does is it takes a function and makes it become your props. So you write a function that gets all the data out of the store. It assigns it to property names. You pass that into a component, and that's how data gets into the component so that it can be displayed. Okay? The way that you do this, if you're not using Redux, is you would use, in React, you would use a pipeline like a component will mount, I think is the name of it. So whenever a component mounts, it will go out and maybe call an API and return some data and display it. So what you're doing with connect is you're saying, I don't want you to go out and get the data on your own. I have all the data. It's in the store. I'm going to tell you where the data is. And that's what the connect command does. So you can do that for not only passing props, but also dispatch functions, which are basically your click events. Clear as mud? Good. All right. So here's what I want you to do. I did not write anything specific for this this evening. So we're going to go in and look at a bunch of samples and see if we can make heads or tails out of them. So if you could open up your browser, any browser will do. Chrome, IE, Firefox, I don't care. And just go to codesandbox.io. I'll leave that up there for a few minutes so people can remember that, bookmark it, whatever you have to do. Okay, so don't drop your microphone, Bill. Sorry, Rich. Okay, so this just cycles around here and it switches from Vue to React. I showed you this earlier. What we want to do is we want to go into examples of React and see if we can find some examples that show you useful stuff about Redux. Okay? So, you can see here that there are 114,000 different React samples. We could spend weeks doing this. For each sample, it has the URL, and then it also shows you when it was published, how many times it's been viewed, how many likes it has, and how many forks it has. Fork means somebody took it, made a copy of it, changed it, and did something more interesting to it. Okay, what we're going to do is I want you to go down to the dependencies, and we want to search for React and React-redux. So we're looking for a sample that combines those two. Since there's only 19,000, this will take us a while to go through. Okay? And it comes up with a bunch of them, and I'm going to sort of pick these at random. And the way I usually judge these things is by the views, and then also by how many times they were forked. Because most of us don't bother to like click the like button. But if they forked it, it means they wanted to make one on their own. So let's start with a real simple one. Let's go down to counter. So counter has, a lot of people are looking at this one. Let it load. And I can show you what it does, just an example. You can see here that it, pretty exciting, you click a plus button and it increments a counter. And now, are you, wait for this, wait. You can go backwards. Now, if you click increment if odd, that doesn't work unless you're at an odd number and then it goes to 6. Woohoo, that's fancy. And then my favorite one is increment async. And if you click that like 20 times real fast, come on, you can do it. It increments in the background. Now, that last one's sort of interesting because that would be hard to do in a traditional app where you're like sort of hardwired to the data, because the button event would automatically change the data and then it would wait until that was done, then it would do the next button event. And since we're sending messages, they can sort of queue up. All right, so let's look and see how some of this was done. So what I do, because I have a smaller screen than you do, because of the projector, let's tear this apart and see if it makes any sense. So we have here, under source, we have index.js. And since it's a React app, it has to import these two to actually display anything on the screen. The next line, it actually does something that I showed in the slides. It wants to create a store. So it's going to create a store, and that comes from Redux, not from React-redux. It creates the store as a constant, so it can't be changed. I gotta get rid of the chair. And then each of the developers that does these samples has their own little idiosyncrasies. This guy, rather than do the document get by element ID down below in the render method, he actually creates a constant and then he puts that in here. Just interesting way to do it. So, what is he doing here? He has remember in React, all your components have to have a single element. And that element is an instance of counter. Okay, counter is capitalized. What does that mean? Come on now. It's a component. So if it's a component, where do you think I'm going to find it? In components. Ooh. So if I go to counter, aha. So counter, somewhere in here, is going to have the HTML that actually does that wonderful looking screen. Okay? So at least we know that much. Go back to index. So they're using the basic commands I mentioned that come from Redux. So they're passing in something called value to the counter component. And that value is going to be set to whatever the current state of the store is. Now, in the slides, I showed you this thing called connect. They're not using connect. They're doing it sort of the manual way, but they're still passing in the state. And then they're creating two different button click events, on increment and on decrement, and those are going to dispatch messages. The messages are technically called actions. So you're going to, on increment, you're going to send a type of increment, type of decrement. Does an action have to have a payload in it? Apparently not, because this is an object and all it does is have a type. And it's assumed in this simple application that every time you increment or decrement, you're decrementing or incrementing by 1. Okay? If you wanted to be able to change how much you increment or decremented by, we would have to pass that in the message, in the action. Okay, so let's see. I'm creating a store and I have a thing called counter. Do you notice counter comes from this thing called reducers? So let's go into the reducers folder. Yes. I don't know how to do that. Do I do that here? Okay. You mean the house volume? I am a booming... How does that work? Is that better? But I'm used to always... Gotcha. Thank you for that feedback. Okay. Now, so if I go to reducers folder, this is one of those curious things about the world of JavaScript, and this is actually an ES6 thing. It's not really a React thing. So if I'm importing counter from reducers, reducers doesn't have a file called counter. So the rule of thumb is, was that too loud? Okay. I was emphasizing thumb. Okay, the rule of thumb is if you have an index.js in a folder, then it can have all the stuff you need to create whatever it is the person's looking for. And the other thing that I find hard to follow in this kind of programming, even though that in the top level index.js, even though I import counter from reducers, the word counter isn't going to exist anywhere in the reducer. But by me saying import counter from reducers, I'm taking that code and I'm assigning it the name counter. And then when I refer to counter anywhere else in this particular code file, it knows where it came from. Okay, so we go back to reducers index.js. What does counter do? Well, it is going to take in a state, whatever state is passed to it, and it is going to assume that the state has a value. If it does not, it's going to default it to 0. This is an ES6 trick. So when we create a function and we give it parameters, we can supply default values on the fly. Okay? I'm also passing in basically two things to a reducer. The state as it exists now and the action. Okay? Then I'm going to look at the action. The action has two things. And one is the string that defines the actions message. The second is the payload. Payload's optional. So if I ask for the action.type, I know that right now there's only two things it can do, increment and decrement. So all it's going to do is it's going to return state plus 1. Okay? It doesn't change state. It doesn't say state equals state plus 1. It returns state plus 1, which is a new object, and it's going to have a different number than state had. Okay? Why does it have a default option at the bottom? Well, it's not necessarily a payload. What if some goofy programmer on your team dispatched an action that wasn't defined? If you default return state, any action that isn't defined is just ignored. So it makes it sort of bulletproof. I mean, you could do something here, like you could log the fact that somebody is calling an action that doesn't exist. It's what? Did you hear what he said? That was a dirty word. Tell them.
That's idiomatic redux.
Yes.
If a message or an action is passed and it doesn't match a specific reducer, you want that reducer to return the current state.
Yes.
Because the way React works, it's detecting changes in the shadow DOM by changes in what's in the store. So if this is returning the same state object to the provider, it's passing those props to the rest of the components. They're all looking, is that the same piece of state that in memory of that object?
Right. So by returning the same state, it can look at it and say, nothing changed here, nothing to see. And all of the subscribers will just ignore the fact that this happened. But if we decrement and it returns back a new state, everybody that subscribes to this state will automatically know it has to display something. So I like that idiomatic word, though. That's cool. All right, so that's a reducer. And then what else did we do here? So that's counter. And then down here, we did the store. So we did all that nonsense. So the only other thing to look at in counter is this idea of props. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but props is how we pass data into a component in React. And it's saying here, it's binding stuff. You have to call this thing called super. And basically, this is how we're going to get the store, which has a number in it, and have that return back to... now, what's weird here is there is really no schema to this object. It's basically just a single number. That's all the store is. Yes? You mean over here, that and that? Okay. So yes, go ahead. So the question, or his comment was that all three of these things that I'm showing on the screen right now would be considered props. So the props can be data values. It can also be functions. And the two that are functions, that's how you actually wire up events like clicks or mouse moves. And what we're saying here is that in the world of Redux, the values are going to come from the state of the store, and the things that you do, like clicking, are going to be mapped to actions, and in this case, we're dispatching those. So there's two things. There's the state of the store and the dispatch messages that the reducers understand. Yes. Up here? Yes, correct. Good point. So his point was that the first statement inside the render of this particular React component is it takes the three things that were passed in, value, on, increment, and it assigns the props that were passed in to the three things, value, on, increment, and on decrement. And you could have used a spread operator here because that would automatically have taken the props and spread, but that's a whole other ES6 thing. So how are they using this? Well, they are taking the value and displaying it, and then in the on click, they're actually doing the methods. Okay? So, there you go. And I don't remember where they're doing this one, increment if odd. Is that up above? Good point. Okay. So increment if odd, basically it's just checking there to see what the value is, and if it's allowed based on this mathematical formula, then it's going to call the on increment, and the async one is actually going to do the increment, but it's going to do a timeout, and that's why you can click like 10 in a row and it just makes a whole bunch of timeouts and then they all fire a second later. All right. Simple example. Woohoo. So we saw some of the technology that I explained in the slides. Now, at this point, I'm going to do a back button on my browser. And go look at one of the other ones here. There's a to-do list. This one seems popular. It's been used a lot. It's been forked a lot. So let's go look at the to-do list. Okay. Different from the last example, this one is actually using React-redux. And if you look up at the top at the code, you will see right here that it imports provider with a capital P from React-redux. Now, by convention, they make provider capitalized so that it makes sense in the JSX fragment down below. Technically, provider is not a component, I guess, but it is used to wrap the rest of the app. And I told you to watch for this when I showed you the slides. The reason we're doing this is now anything inside of app has access to the context. Then the context has the data from the store. And the way you do that is you pass the store into the provider. Oh, good. Paint's on sale. We better run. Okay. So, again, they're importing their reducers, and they're creating the store from the reducers. Let's go look at the reducers. So the reducers, let's go down to reducers. So that is from this folder, reducers. So if you just open that folder, you'll see it has multiple files, one of which is index.js. Now, in my slides, when I talked about reducers, I said that you usually make one parent reducer that can handle all the messages, all the actions. And the way you do that is you import something called combine reducers. Seems simple. And what combine reducer does is it will take any number of reducers and make them all accessible by one function, so that we don't have to keep track of all these other functions. The other reducers can be in separate files. They could be written by separate developers. How do we know where to-dos is? Well, it's pretty simple. If I highlight it, it says ./to-dos. And where's the visibility filter? Same idea. Let's go look at them. Well, this one is a reducer that works with to-dos. It adds to-dos to the current list of to-dos. And a bunch of the examples, or a bunch of the line items I had in my slides, are illustrated here as it applies to reducers. So a reducer can work with simple variables like strings and numbers. It can work with objects, it can work with arrays. When you're working with an array, remember, you can't change the array that's coming in. Correct? So if I want to add a new to-do to the list, I can't use array.push, because that would change the original array. So what I do instead is I return a new array. See these two lines here? And I should probably do that from the screen so the people at home could see what I'm pointing at. So if I highlight this and this, basically I'm returning a brand new array. What does the array have in it? Well, the array has in it whatever is in the current state. Now, I want you to be honest with me. How many have ever used this syntax in JavaScript? 3 dots. Do you know what it does? You want to learn this. That's called the spread operator. Probably has to do with betting or poker or something. I don't know. But what that does, suppose you have 5 to-dos. When you go ... state, it makes an array that has all 5 of the existing to-dos. It spreads them out and makes them part of the new array. And then you have a comma, and you have whatever the person passed in as the additional to-do. So it basically does the same thing a push does. It adds the new one to the end of the existing one. But remember, in the world of Redux, the existing one still lives, because we're going to take the state and replace it, or we're going to create a new state. And don't worry about memory, because technically it doesn't keep like all the old ones in memory, unless you specifically ask it to do that. Okay, now I'm passing it an action. The action has an ID. It has some, it has a payload, and the action has in it these things: ID, text, and completed. So I can use that to add to the particular list of to-dos. It's not unusual for reducers to handle different types of action messages. So in this case, it uses a switch statement so that it can decide between add to do or toggle to do. Toggle to do means I'm going to mark it as completed. So it's going to display different. And how do I do that? Well, I pass in the existing to do. It's a single one. I see if its ID matches the one, and if it does, then I take that to do, I keep all its existing properties, and take completed and override it with the opposite of what completed was now. It's a weird syntax, but basically a to-do has an ID, a text, and completed. So this syntax here says make an object that has ID, text, and completed. but then you can take completed and overwrite it. Clear as mud? Good. All right, and this syntax here, very popular. This is a can somebody say that for me? Ternary. Yeah. I think he was a defensive back for the Browns. Yeah. Okay. So anyways, true or false statement here. If it's true, do this. If it's false, do that. And the cool kids put these in separate lines. It makes them easier to read and understand. The old school guys like Rob and I, we just write straight across the line and make the lines really wide so it's hard to read. And that way nobody else can maintain it, right? So, all right. What does visibility filter do? Well, this one is, I have no idea. State equals show all. Oh, okay. So we're passing in the action, in the payload, we're actually passing in something called filter. And it's going to decide, I have to think about what this one does. We're not going to debug that right now. Okay. So that is basically what the reducers do in this particular example. Now let's look at, it has some containers. So there's one called add to do. And this has a form in it. And basically what's happening on this one is using the connect statement. So connect, as I mentioned to you, is a more advanced way to do React-redux. And what it does is it automatically maps things, and we're going to pass it the, I'm not sure how to show you this syntax. So, well, there you go. This doesn't show it as simple as I'd like to see it, but that is an example of using the connect statement, which also comes from React-redux. Now, in this one, there's a container that's like an outer component that has a bunch of little components inside of it. And what it's going to do is it's going to display all of the to-dos inside of it, and those are actually done here. And each to-do can be clicked, and the click is going to be mapped using the props. It's going to be mapped to the on-click event there. Okay, so what does this actually run like? It's pretty simple. This doesn't do anything right now. If we say, this is your list for tonight, shovel snow, turn down heat, extra blankets, and probably tomorrow we're going to need hot chocolate. Okay, and they're all active right now. None of them are completed. And the way you complete them is you click them. And that way, when you call the filter reducer, the filter reducer returns back just the ones that match completed true. And the active works that way. Pretty exciting, huh? Okay. So, now again, you can go do these on your own, obviously, but I wanted to show you where to look for them. So we saw an example of connect. We saw an example of provider. We didn't really see action creators. I didn't really see a good example of that. We didn't see middleware, but we did see the store with the get state and the dispatch. We did not see a subscribe. We saw reducers, we saw states, and we saw actions. So all those things I tried to explain to you before, we've already seen some examples of them. Let's do a back button here. And I'm going to look at another one. Let's look at shopping cart, see how he did his. Oh boy. So in the shopping cart, I'll just run the app this time first. In the shopping cart, if I click add to cart, it throws things down into the cart. There's no way to remove them, but that's okay. It's just a simple example. And when I check out, it empties the cart and starts all over. Okay, so the question is, how is some of this structured? And what you'll see, this guy decided to make a folder for his actions. He made a folder for his constants, and he made one for his reducers. Then he put his containers and components in separate folders. So you're starting to see a sort of prescribed pattern to structure your application. Now, the other thing this one does is it uses this thing called thunk, and I really don't know what that does. So I'm gonna skip over that part. But this adds a bunch of extra things. It does Redux Logger, it does thunk. So it adds a couple extra cool stuff that's going on. Just like I showed you in the previous example, it wraps the whole thing in provider, applies the store so that it has all the data in all the components. The difference in this example is here. The other two examples I showed you only had a call to reducer. And the reducer returned back a single function that may or may not have combined all the other reducers. But this example takes it a step further, and it applies middleware. And the middleware is one of those slides I showed you that sort of moves things to the next level. And the middleware actually comes from Redux. It's not part of React-redux, it's part of Redux. Okay. Now, let's go take a look at constants. One of the things he does in this example, which is considered good practice, is he defines all of his actions in a file called constants. Well, in this case, a folder called constants. And there are 5 possible actions. And all you do is you create a constant and make it equal to that string. Sort of an odd syntax, but that's all they do. And then the actions themselves, whoops, I should go to reducers first. So if you look at index.js, that's the main or top level of the reducers. And what it's going to do is combine cart and products. And it's going to add a bunch of extra reducers. And I'm not going to look exactly how it's doing all the math and stuff, but it's doing math here to figure out the total cost of your shopping cart. So it has to take each of the items that you chose, times the quantities, look at the prices, and come up with a total and store the total. So that sort of makes sense. And then products, it just allows you to add products to an array, similar to what we did earlier. Now this is interesting here. Products is itself, where does it do that? There you go. So what you're exporting from this particular file, you're combining multiple reducers into one called products, which are then combined into the other. So you can have like subtrees of these, and a very large application could end up with hundreds of reducers. Wouldn't that be fun to keep track of? Oh, he was saying, he was thinking that this seems like it would be hard to follow and debug. But compared to having a standard MVC app where you have one big, like a whole bunch of data structures, it's probably the same amount of things to keep track of. The difference here is the fact that everything is in one store, and there are tricks and there are add-ons to Chrome and other browsers that let you sort of visually watch the store as things happen. And the next app I'll show you will show an example of that. But you bring up an interesting point there. But what I wanted to show you here is that you can nest reducers as many levels as you need to. So this is a good example of that. And then in the actions folder, what he does here is he creates a bunch of functions, and these are what I referred to as action creators. So these are functions that actually dispatch actions to change the store. So the front end components are actually going to call, like, get all products. They're not going to actually call store.dispatch. And get all products knows how to send the proper action and the right payload data. So, all right. The last one I'm going to show you is this one here that's called Real World. Okay, now, this one has some interesting stuff on this side. And there are tools that are part of the Redux React world where people have developed things like this that allow you to actually see the state as you pass messages back and forth. Now, I said that there are tools like in Chrome that allow you to go into the console and sort of look at what's happening to the state. This one actually lets you see it. And you'll notice if I look up my GitHub account, okay, it returns back the picture from my GitHub account and my proper name and stuff like that. Okay, now you can see here that the message that was passed, the action called user request, once that action completed, the state changed. So the state used to have 2 keys. Now it has 2 keys. And error message of null, or I'm sorry. So the state doesn't seem to have okay, starred request. Okay, so after you do starred request, then it comes back and it says, okay, the login of the of this is Bill J. Wolf, and it returns back some data, and then it does a starred success, then it does a user success, And somewhere down here, it should show me that it actually has data that returned back from the API call to GitHub. So, Rob, what's your thing?
Row 5 IS.
Row 5 dash IS? That? Ooh, how modern. I like the, see nothing here. I like that. So, so anyways, what's that?
Nothing to see here.
Move on. Now let's revert this. I don't know what that means. I don't even know what that does. But that's sort of cute. But I'm running out of time. But if we were to look at the code for this one, basically, this guy does the same kind of thing. He has his reducers in one folder. He has his actions in another folder. He does not have constants, but he does have middleware. And all of this ties together again. In this case, he's not using provider. He's just configuring the store. And the configure store actually comes from store, configure store, which is right there. And what this guy is doing is he's checking to see whether he's in production or not. And he is calling the proper value based on that. And then he actually goes and, in this case, he's doing the apply middleware. And he's also using the compose function from Redux. So, interesting. So, any questions on this stuff? You're wondering how you're going to type it yourself. I don't like this example. It has too many weird. It is sort of fancy. He's showing a bunch of links to different like blogs and websites. But this one, the code, similar. This is the most popular one here. But again, he has lots and lots of reducers. And you can go through here and you can see that there are just tons of these things. So. All right, so any questions on Redux? I can see you're all excited to run home and try this. Okay, before we bring Rob up to do a short demo, a little lesson on learning. So, other than this code sandbox thing, I'll show you what I use. About a year and a half ago, I went to Egghead, and I liked some of their videos. It's egghead.io. Okay, and I should be able to sign in here if it remembers who I am. Okay, so you'll see that there's a whole bunch of classes here. So you can learn React, you can get started with Angular, get started with Redux. And these are some of the titles that I've been playing around with. And I'm so excited, I finished 116 lessons. Now, the reason I like this one is that the lessons are very short. So most of the lessons are like anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes. So if you're doing stuff in between other activities during work, you can sort of just go through a short lesson, sort of pick up a little snack of information and move on with your life. Some of the stuff on Egghead is free. If you get a pro membership, then you have access to all the courses. A lot of the Microsoft developer camp would not be interested in this because most of the content is non-Microsoft. But the reason I got into this a couple years ago is to learn more about Angular, advanced CSS stuff like Flexbox. So those are the kinds of topics that you find on here. Now, some of it's interesting because, see this course here? Dan Abramov is the guy who invented Redux. So his course is on this site. Anybody else use Egghead ever? Once in their life? Good. 3 people. Okay, so the other one, and I'm not even sure how to get to it. Okay. Shouldn't it just let me in here? See, this is the problem. I never... just to go to LinkedIn. This is an advertisement again. But then everybody will see all of my connections. Oh, for Christ's sakes. All right, there we are. No, I have 1,300. I'm sorry. So, Rob, do you remember how to get to... that one there. Anyways, learning is an additional charge to a LinkedIn user. I think it comes if you have LinkedIn Premium. Now, trivia question. Who owns LinkedIn? Microsoft. What company did LinkedIn buy before they were bought by Microsoft? Lynda.com. So basically, this is a rebranding of Lynda.com, which was very popular for many years, and has thousands and thousands of courses on all sorts of topics. Now, if you're LinkedIn Premium, you now have access to all this nonsense. And you can see there's a course here that I went through called SQL Tips and Tricks. And of course, I'm not going to remember. Does it actually show which ones? Yeah, there's one in progress. Okay. Well, it doesn't remember the one I was on. So we were going to look at Redux. Learning Redux. Is that it, Rob? Okay. So I will say this. This is a shameless plug. I went through this entire course this week. I was extremely impressed with how the software worked from LinkedIn. What they do is they show you. Now, I didn't point it out in Egghead. In Egghead, they actually have the transcript of what the person's saying. They have the video, and then they also have the code samples. This has the same thing. You can actually follow. But what I really like about this one is if we go to a lesson and say like the history of Redux, it starts playing the video. Swear to God. And you may or may not hear it. I don't even think I have it plugged in. But my point is that you can go to the transcript, and this is cool. As the guy reads, it actually follows the transcript. So you can go, but the reason I like this is you can do this. You can go down and say, I really wanted this part of the course. And it actually moves ahead in the course to exactly what the guy's saying. And it follows, and if you're trying to remember what he said, reading it helps you in addition to hearing it. And that's good. And the quality of the video and stuff was very good here. See, action, dispatcher, store, view. That makes sense. Okay. So if you have a chance, check this out. The other one that's popular, and I don't remember, I don't use this one too much, but how many have a subscription to Pluralsight? Now that's interesting. So that's probably maybe 20% of the room has a Pluralsight. Very popular for corporations to buy subscriptions for their employees. And this has lots of courses. The courses here, hey, look, I just have logins to everything. I don't know. And there you go. I'm logged in. So, you know, we want to learn software development. Okay, and then we go down here, and you will. Oh, I'll do this later. I see. Oh, it was profiling me. You can tell how long ago I've used this. Yes. That really goes back a long time. But let's look for Redux. I'm sure they have something here. Oh, there's a Redux saga. Advanced Redux. Oh, that's what I want. I don't want to start at the beginner stuff. Okay, so that's not bad. That's a 3-hour course, and I'm sure it covers a lot of the same stuff. So for those of you that have Pluralsight, I think that's a good option. And you know, can I say one's better than the other? I'd have to actually sit through multi-hour course in each of them. That'd be really tedious. Yes, Tony.
Somebody online is suggesting Safari Books online.
Safari Books Online.
From David Crane.
Okay. All right. And would that be also have videos, or is it just reading?
I think that's just lecture.
Yeah. Yes, sir. UDEMY. That's Udemy, and that's another learning site. So there's a ton of them out there.
David did say that it does have videos and tutorials.
Very good. Excellent. Excellent. So Safari Books is another good resource. So at some point we're going to, as we do more with this series of labs, we'll put something on the site that with pointers to these ones and tell you which ones we like. Now, with some help from Rob and/or Rich, if I go to YouTube, how do I find our recordings from our lab series here? Darn, that's that type ahead stuff. I bet they're using Redux for that. Okay, now, this is very disappointing. We need, how many subscribe to this? Okay, well, the rest of you, please go home and subscribe. And the reason we want you to do that is that if we get over 100 subscribers, then what do we get, Mr. Rich?
One of the things that we get like
Excellent. We want that vanity URL. It doesn't cost you anything to subscribe. And the truth is if you subscribe and then like 3 weeks later you unsubscribe, we probably will have already met our goal and everything's happy.
And if you want, we can show you how to do it because it doesn't look like you've subscribed. So if we go ahead and click that Philly.net, well, hit the logo first for the site. There you go. And now you got that big red button there in the corner. We're up to 64. We've gone up about 10 people since being there tonight.
Damn.
So there you go. We'll make it 65. There.
And that's all I have to do?
That's it.
That's really difficult.
So we need 35 more of you to go ahead and do that, and we'll be able to get our vanity URL up there. So
excellent. Okay. Now here's Rob on this picture doing Pledge of Allegiance. Either that or heartburn. This is Tony when he had a shorter haircut. And this is a code camp about 2 years ago because we only ever did the chairs once. I remember doing that. Okay, so in there, Rich Ross and Chris Gomez and Tony and Rob are all helping with this. And they are starting to take all of our learnings here and record them forever. And you can sit there at home and play all of these. It's really exciting.
It's actually all Rich.
Okay. He does all the effort, and he has fancy equipment in the back of the room to do all this.
I will post. I actually did take a picture. I'm going to post it up on Twitter in a little bit. So.
All right. Do you want to show this thing or? Okay. So Rob is going to come up, and I have one slide for him to work with. He has a slide. So the other thing we wanted to do is add a little insight into this thing called RxJS. It's all yours.
You have it already set up here? Or,
I have no idea. Okay, so you can, well, do you want to talk about the slide or do you want to go to the code?
we can just go to the code.
Okay, so I will talk about the slide real quick since Rob doesn't want to. And I will tell you that RxJS is reactive programming and it uses these things called observables. And basically, an observable is an invocable collection of future values. Typically, you use this to go out and get some data like from a REST API. When it returns, it turns into an observable and people can subscribe to the observable. It's a fancy way to get data in the background. The cool thing about it is you can like cancel the requests and stuff on the fly. So the way you would get into this, do you want to plug in yours?
Yeah,
Or
I can
Rob's going to plug in his and show you a quick demo.
Can you hear me? Thanks. I have to turn this up?
You're on.
It's on. How's that, better? So there's a couple different things on the code sandbox. This one's a real simple one, the one I have the URL up there for right now. So if you want to go there, you can. Finding it might be a little more difficult. So I'll just leave that there for a second or two. So what this is going to show is setting up an observable and then subscribing to it and then processing it. And this is not using anything externally to do this right now. So in the next example, we'll show you one that actually uses a URL that's sitting out there that's available. All right, so if we take a look at this real quick, we've got this import Rx from RxJS. So you do that import thing like you do for everything else. And then down here, where we're actually going to use it, we're setting up a little observable with a bunch of parameters, a bunch of extra pieces to it. So what this observable is going to do is it's going to, every 100th of a millisecond or whatever it is, it's going to generate a random number, or an ever increasing number. And then there's this thing called a map. And the map allows us to do some work. In this case, we're going to take a random number and we're going to do some mathematical stuff to it. And then there's this thing called a scan. And what the scan does is it takes the previous state and the current state, and you can do some manipulation of it. So what we've got is we've got this number, and we're creating this thing called a sum from the previous sum plus the current value. So that current value is that random number that gets generated. And we have a count, which is just incrementing every time we call this scan. And then below that, right here, you can see we've set up some default values for our sum and our count. Okay. So the first time this thing runs, sum's going to be 0, count's going to be 0. It's going to add 0 to the current value, and then it's going to add 1 to the count. So you're going to have 1, and you're going to have whatever value it is, right? And then this last map is what we actually take out of this observable. That's what we get back from it when we subscribe to it. And in this case, what we're doing is we're creating this total. So we're creating an object with a total, which is the count. So that's how many times we've called this. And we've got an average where we take the sum of our random numbers and we divide it by the count. Simple stuff, right? So that's our observable. So that's generating a bunch of data. And that is in a variable called avg. So then down here, what we're doing is we're subscribing to that observable. So that means every time a change happens, this is going to get notified and something's going to happen. So in this case, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, we're going to set the state. And what we're doing is we're taking all the existing state value messages and we're putting it into messages. So we're just taking what's already there, putting it back into messages, and we're appending to the end of it this average and a total. That's all we're doing. Now in the render portion of this code, we're just saying go out and map that message to get the message back from the observable, and that's all we're doing. So we're taking the state.message and we're sending it into MSG and we're displaying it. And if you look at this thing, so it's been running here for a while, it gets annoying because as soon as you open this thing up, it starts to run. So there it is. It's been running for I don't know how long while it's been sitting up here. And you can see that every time, and if we go down to the bottom, you can see it's still running and it just keeps going and going. And you can see that his numbers are incrementing. And because it's run so many times, remember what, 13,000 times it's been called? So that the average number is sort of normalizing itself down to about 287. For whatever reason, that's where it's getting to be put. So that's all we're doing for that. So there's an example of setting up an observable and then subscribing to it. All right, so let's take a look at this other one that Bill had worked on, and I don't know if he's got it.
I did.
You did save it, so I don't know if I have to.
You know how to set the font bigger.
Oh,
That's in your options. Somewhere up top, there's a settings here, I think there. Font size, where you can change the font size.
what would you like it to be?
18.43.
Better?
That's a little bit.
All right. So in this sample,
Oh, you're not. You're doing both monitors.
yeah, all the monitors of this. What are you talking about? Both monitors.
Just show the top monitor. It'll make the screen wider, the type bigger.
All right.
Or
Well,
you can just do what you're doing.
I'll just do what I'm doing now. That's no big deal. All right. So in this example, what we've got is this, and Bill's already fixed this up. So let me just get up here and see if we can
Forgot I saved it.
zoom in. That's okay. I'm sure you
You
did.
had to refresh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, no.
Is it big enough? Ah, it's in the way. I think I made it too big. All right, well, there it is. It's 4QWQR4P9, for those who can read that. And I'll refresh this and see if we get the latest version. And there it is.
There it is.
All right. So I'll wait for it to transpile.
I really feel like I'm getting stuff done.
Yeah, it makes it, there you go. Okay. The interesting one, I think, in this example is the step 3, I think, shows it the best. So let me just do this. All right. Wait for it. Okay. So this is similar to what we just looked at with the observable stuff, except in this case, we're calling a URL, and we're doing it with an AJAX call. So we're doing an RX observable. We're setting all that stuff up here. And then they do something called Flux, so it gets the response back. And then they map the titles from the resulting query that gets sent out to Wikipedia. We're getting the titles and the URLs, and that's what we're mapping. And then what we're doing is we're taking that and sticking it out into the view. So it's the same thing we were doing before, except this time we're actually calling an external site. So this is in step 3. So if we run that step 3, and we get a little search window here, and we type in, because we have to. Oh, screwed it up. Refresh that. Oh, I can't stand that. All right. I don't know why it's not working. Huh, interesting. Right, well, it must be me. So if you type in something into the search window, I won't do it right now because apparently it doesn't like me. It will go out to Wikipedia and look up whatever it is that you're typing in there. So I will try it one more time. Nope. Article is not defined. All right, so what it will do is it'll go out and do a search, and it will come back with a list of articles that are looked up based off what you type in. So if you typed in Philadelphia Eagles, it would come back with a list of things that relate to the Philadelphia Eagles and the links to those Wikipedia articles that would show up. So I'm sure you can all try this yourself, and it'll probably work wonderfully for you. And if not, we can blame Bill because he modified this. See, it says so right there. Author, Bill J. Wolf. Yes. All right, so that's just another example. The key thing is the mapping. That's what takes the data from the observable and exposes it out. And then the subscribing to it is what allows it to be updated when things. There's a little thing here. Article is not defined. I didn't change this. Well, we're not going to debug it right now because we've only got about 10 minutes to go. So you guys can figure this out yourself. But that's the basic idea of what RxJS does for you. So it goes out and allows you to do that kind of stuff. And what you will see when it runs for you is that as you type, it goes out and does searches. And if you backspace, it does more searches, but it doesn't have to bring back the original searches, right? So you're canceling, it cancels out the request automatically as as you type this stuff out. So that's what's neat about that. And that's what all the big boys use for their getting access.
RxJS has a lot of add-on, like if you look up at the top on line 8, so an observable in Rx has an AJAX method that can go out and hit URLs, so you don't need like a third-party tool to go and get stuff from websites.
Right.
It does care, and you can chain all these things together, so as soon as it returns back the result, then you can plot for the response.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you can map it, and it has all these extra verbs and things that allow you to take the data and shape it the way you need it before you throw it into your store or put it into your model.
Yes. And if you go to the documentation for RxJS, I don't know if I have it here someplace, but there is a crap load of things you can put on that observable command. And you saw some in the other example where there was that the count or the instance verb, and there's a bunch of other ones that are in there that allow you to do a whole bunch of stuff. And pretty much anything you want to do, you do rx.observable.something, and it just goes on forever. So there you go. Any questions about this? I know it was short, but we didn't have much time. No? Okay. Well, the first one worked, so there you go. All right, so that's all we've got. You might want to have your glasses back.
We do thank you for coming. So I guarantee the meeting or the lab next month will be a lot more hands-on stuff for you to do. And as we promised, we're going to have you do a very simple app in all 3 frameworks. Again, most of that's probably going to be done in Code Sandbox and the equivalent of it for Angular. It's easier than you having to install Visual Studio and download a whole bunch of NPM packages. So that's probably what we're going to do the first week in February. That will be in 5 weeks, I believe. And 3 weeks from tonight, come back and you can learn all about Kubernetes and Helm and Docker and all that neat stuff inside of Azure. And more importantly, you'll get a overview of what's new in the world of Visual Studio and .NET Framework from the product team from Jeff Fritz. And have a good 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and see you on the 24th.
Friday, CodeCamp, same price?
Yes, the CodeCamp pricing will be exactly the same as it was before. We're very boring like that.
Oh, I love it.
So, yep. So at least you have the date. You know where the date is on the meetup site, and you could start socializing that in your company. And what's that?
Don't do that.
Oh! I see what you're saying. It is hard to get those tickets. Yes, they do sell out very quickly. Yes, I do know. It's in an email that I sent. I don't have it handy. Typically, I do that about 6 weeks before the event. So I think it's like the first or second Tuesday in February. And the reason I do it on a Tuesday, I figure some people take off Mondays. So we're going to sell the tickets on a Tuesday, and then they'll all be gone by Wednesday or Thursday. That's the drill. All right. Have a good night, and hurry home because there's a blizzard coming. We're going to have almost 4 inches.